What you're about to hear isn't the sanitized version found in history books. According to declassified U.S. Army operational records and post-war sniper debriefings, the deadliest enemy in parts of Southeast Asia was not always holding a rifle. Sometimes, it flowed quietly beneath the fog. Military archives show that during covert operations in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, rivers were initially classified as natural corridors ideal for stealth movement, observation, and infiltration. On maps, they looked harmless. Blue lines cutting through green terrain. Predictable. Passive. But for U.S. Army snipers operating deep behind enemy lines, these rivers quickly revealed themselves as something else entirely. They were alive. And they were hostile. Pay close attention to what follows, because this is the side of war few veterans speak about openly. Not because it lacks importance, but because the fear it created was constant, invisible, and impossible to fight head-on. Snipers are trained to control variables. Wind. Distance. Breathing. Time. Rivers erased that control. At first, teams used waterways as concealment. Moving slowly along riverbanks allowed them to avoid patrols, mask footprints, and maintain a low acoustic profile. Jungle doctrine encouraged it. But within weeks of deployment, after the first losses and near misses, reports began to change tone. Rivers stopped being described as terrain features. They became threat environments. One sniper report from 1968 describes a simple crossing at dawn. No enemy contact. No gunfire. Just a routine repositioning. Halfway across, the current shifted without warning. Mud gave way beneath the boots. Equipment dragged downward. The rifle, the sniper's lifeline, nearly disappeared beneath the surface. It took less than 10 seconds for the crossing to turn into a fight for survival. Silent. Sudden. Almost fatal. That was the psychological pattern that would repeat itself again and again. Rivers in Southeast Asia were not static. Rainfall dozens of miles upstream could transform a shallow crossing into a violent, chest-high torrent within minutes. Snipers learned often too late that the river you studied at dusk was not the river you faced at dawn. And unlike an ambush, there was no warning sign. No movement in the tree line. No sound of metal or voices. Just the water changing its mind. But the current was only the beginning. Military after-action reports reveal growing awareness of what lurked beneath the surface. Leeches that attached silently and drained blood over hours. Aggressive aquatic snakes disturbed by movement. Sharp submerged debris, sharpened bamboo stakes, broken branches, remnants of enemy traps placed deliberately along likely crossing points. Some were natural. Others were not. Enemy forces understood the river better than any map ever could. They mined banks, disguised tripwires underwater, and used the river's noise to conceal movement. A sniper focused on maintaining balance could miss everything else, the ripple that wasn't natural, the shadow that moved against the flow. And then there was the psychological weight. Snipers described rivers as places where vigilance collapsed inward. In the jungle, eyes scan outward. In the river, fear turns internal. Every step becomes a calculation. Every second spent exposed feels longer than a firefight. You can't sprint. You can't dive. You can't return fire at what you can't see. Your body is committed. And retreat is often impossible. Operational documents show that entire missions were altered because of rivers. Firing positions abandoned. Observation windows missed. Teams delayed until conditions changed or didn't. In some cases, snipers were forced to choose between crossing a river they didn't trust or staying pinned in territory that was no longer secure. This is where the rivers stopped being routes and became weapons. As the war progressed, U.S. sniper doctrine quietly adapted. Crossing techniques changed. Equipment loads were rebalanced. Routes were planned around rivers instead of through them. Not because of enemy presence, but because the river itself had earned a reputation. In the minds of those who survived, water was no longer neutral terrain. It was an adversary that never slept, never revealed intent, and never left evidence behind. And this was only the first lesson. Because among the many dangers these snipers faced, the rivers would soon prove capable of something far worse than injury or isolation. They could erase teams entirely without a single shot fired. What made the rivers truly terrifying was not what could be seen, but what could not. According to field intelligence summaries compiled between 1967 and 1971, U.S. Army snipers began reporting a recurring psychological phenomenon during river operations, an overwhelming sense of being watched from below. Not by the enemy on the banks, but by the water itself. A perception that something unseen was waiting for the moment their footing failed. This wasn't superstition. It was experience. Rivers in Southeast Asia were ecosystems engineered by both nature and war. Slow-moving sections concealed deep sinkholes formed by erosion. Faster currents masked sudden drop-offs where the riverbed simply vanished. A sniper stepping forward would feel solid ground 1 second and nothing the next. The body reacts faster than the mind. The heart spikes. Breath disappears. Muscles tense against resistance that isn't there. And in that moment, training collapses into instinct. Veteran snipers later described the sensation as being pulled, not swept. As if the river had hands. Equipment straps snagged on submerged roots. Webbing filled with water and dragged downward. Boots designed for jungle traction became anchors once soaked. One declassified debrief recounts a two-man sniper team attempting a nighttime crossing to reach an elevated firing position overlooking a supply route. Visibility was near zero. The river sounded calm. Midway through, the point man vanished without a splash. Just gone. The second sniper felt the tension in the line go slack, then jerk violently. He never saw his partner again. No enemy contact was recorded. No shots fired. The mission log simply notes, personnel lost during river crossing. Presumed drowned. A single sentence. No details. No recovery. But the survivors remembered everything. As these incidents accumulated, fear began to attach itself to specific sensory triggers. The smell of wet vegetation. The feel of cold water seeping into fabric. The muted roar of a current just loud enough to mask movement. Snipers reported heightened anxiety long before reaching the riverbank, sometimes hours in advance. This wasn't cowardice. It was pattern recognition. Because beneath the surface, the rivers were layered with threats that punished distraction. Water snakes struck reflexively at movement. Freshwater crocodiles, though rarely seen, were documented in certain regions in tributaries. But more common and more lethal were human-made hazards. Enemy forces learned quickly. Operational maps captured after engagements revealed deliberate river denial strategies. Bamboo stakes sharpened and angled downstream. Tripwires submerged just below visibility, attached to grenades buried in the mud along banks. Mines placed where soldiers instinctively reached for support while climbing out. A sniper crossing a river had no margin for error. Hands occupied. Weapon elevated. Eyes scanning water instead of tree lines. It was the perfect moment to kill without being seen. One veteran recalled the realization hitting him mid-crossing: if something happens here, no one can help you. You don't scream underwater. You don't shoot. You just disappear. That understanding reshaped how snipers perceived risk. A firefight had structure. Angles. Cover. Cause and effect. Rivers offered none of that. They were unpredictable, immune to tactics, and impossible to intimidate. The psychological impact was cumulative. Repeated exposure to river crossings produced symptoms now recognized as early combat stress reactions. Tunnel vision. Auditory distortion. Time dilation. Snipers described counting steps obsessively, gripping rifles until fingers went numb, and imagining contact that never came. But sometimes, it did. Enemy units often waited. Not on the far bank, but downstream. They understood that a compromised sniper emerging from water was slow, disoriented, and vulnerable. Exhausted muscles. Wet optics. Reduced reaction time. The river softened the target. The enemy finished the job. By the end of many operations, the most intense moments hadn't involved gunfire at all. They involved standing at the edge of a river, staring at dark water, knowing that once you stepped in, control was no longer yours. And that fear followed them long after the crossing was over. Because the rivers didn't just threaten the body. They rewired the mind. By the time U.S. Army snipers had accumulated months of combat experience in Southeast Asia, one conclusion had become unavoidable: existing doctrine had not prepared them for rivers. Field manuals described river crossings as logistical problems. Width, depth, current speed, equipment waterproofing. On paper, they were solvable variables. In reality, rivers ignored doctrine entirely. According to internal training evaluations conducted late in the war, snipers consistently reported that no amount of stateside preparation matched the psychological stress of real river operations under combat conditions. Training rivers were controlled, predictable, safe. The rivers of Southeast Asia were none of those things. They punished hesitation. They punished confidence. And they punished routine. Snipers learned that the most dangerous moment wasn't the middle of the crossing, it was the decision to enter. Once committed, options collapsed rapidly. Turning back meant fighting the current. Moving forward meant exposing yourself longer. Standing still was impossible. The river demanded motion, and motion attracted risk. One after-action report details a sniper team forced to abandon a prime overwatch position because the only access route required crossing a tributary known for sudden depth changes. Command initially overruled the concern. The position was tactically ideal. The river, they were told, was manageable. The team crossed anyway. They reached the far bank shaken, soaked, and already fatigued. Optics fogged. Ammunition compromised. One sniper's rifle took in water despite precautions. The firing window they had been sent to exploit passed while they worked to restore equipment. No shots were fired that day. From a command perspective, the mission failed due to delay. From the sniper's perspective, the river had already decided the outcome. These experiences forced snipers to adapt on their own, often improvising techniques outside formal doctrine. They began probing riverbeds with rifle barrels before stepping forward. They crossed at oblique angles to avoid direct current pressure. They memorized water sounds, learning to distinguish between surface flow and submerged turbulence. Most importantly, they stopped trusting appearances. Clear water could be deadly. Murky water could hide footing. A calm surface often masked violent undercurrents. The river that looked safest was frequently the most deceptive. This erosion of trust extended beyond the physical environment. Snipers began questioning mission planning that treated rivers as neutral terrain. They pushed back against orders. Requested alternate routes. In some cases, delayed movement until conditions changed, rain stopped, water levels dropped, light improved. Not all requests were granted. The tension between command expectations and field reality created a new kind of stress. Snipers were trained to accept risk, but rivers introduced risk without agency. You couldn't outshoot a current. You couldn't suppress water. You couldn't intimidate gravity. Veterans later described rivers as the only enemy that never reacted to you. No fear. No hesitation. No mistakes. And then there was isolation. Radio equipment often failed when wet. River noise masked communication. Visual contact between team members broke easily in low visibility crossings. Snipers learned that separation didn't require distance, just a momentary loss of balance. Some never reconnected. Psychologically, rivers became symbols of vulnerability. In the jungle, concealment offered comfort. In rivers, exposure was total. Your silhouette broken. Your movement obvious. Your body slowed. The sense of being hunted intensified, even when no enemy was present. One sniper summarized it years later during a debrief: "On land, I felt like a predator. In the river, I felt like prey." That reversal mattered. It reshaped how snipers evaluated terrain, risk, and survivability. Rivers were no longer obstacles to overcome, they were zones of potential mission collapse. Entire operations were planned around avoiding them, even if it meant longer, more exhausting movement through dense jungle. Because exhaustion was survivable. Rivers, increasingly, were not. By the later stages of the conflict, the fear associated with river crossings had become institutional knowledge passed quietly between units. Not always written. Not always acknowledged. But deeply understood. The doctrine had failed, and experience had rewritten the rules. And still, there was one lesson left to learn. The most damaging effect of the rivers had nothing to do with drowning, traps, or ambushes. It had to do with what followed the war. The war ended. The rivers did not. For many U.S. Army snipers who survived Southeast Asia, the danger of river crossings stayed behind geographically, but not psychologically. Post-war interviews and medical evaluations reveal a pattern that took years to recognize: water had become a trigger. Not oceans. Not rain. Rivers. Veterans described an immediate physiological response when standing near moving water. Accelerated heart rate. Muscle tension. Shallow breathing. A sense of urgency without cause. The same reactions they had felt mid-crossing decades earlier returned without warning. These were not memories. They were reactivations. During the war, rivers had trained the nervous system to expect sudden loss of control. That conditioning didn't fade with time. Civilian life offered no context for it. No language. No acknowledgement. A riverbank in peacetime held no visible threat, which made the fear harder to explain. Some veterans avoided fishing. Others refused to swim in freshwater. A few couldn't cross bridges without gripping the steering wheel until their hands hurt. The sound of flowing water, especially at night, triggered the same mental calculations they once made in combat. Depth. Current. Escape routes. This was the unseen cost of environments that offered no enemy to fight, no victory to claim. Military psychologists later noted that rivers represented a unique stressor because they violated core survival assumptions. Humans expect danger to have intent. Rivers had none. They killed without malice, warning, or pattern. That randomness made them psychologically corrosive. For snipers, whose identity was built around precision and control, the effect was magnified. The river didn't care how skilled you were. It didn't care how disciplined. It didn't care if you were elite. That realization struck at the core of professional confidence. Some veterans recalled dreams that returned for years. They weren't about gunfire or ambushes. They were about stepping into water and never finding the bottom. About being pulled slowly, silently, without resistance. About trying to shout and realizing no sound escaped. Silent. Sudden. Final. As these experiences accumulated, they began influencing training and doctrine in subtle ways. Later generations of soldiers received more detailed instruction on water hazards. Equipment improved. Crossing techniques evolved. Risk assessments became more conservative. But for those who had been there, the change came too late. Their understanding of safe terrain had been permanently altered. Rivers, once symbols of boundaries in life, had become associated with loss and unpredictability. In their memories, water was not cleansing. It was consuming. One retired sniper put it simply: "I can still hear it. The water." It never sounded the same again. This lingering impact extended beyond individual trauma. It reshaped collective memory within sniper communities. Stories were passed down. Warnings shared. Not as official briefings, but as quiet advice between men who understood. Avoid the river if you can. If you can't, respect it. If you don't, it will take something from you. And yet, even this wasn't the final consequence. Because the rivers of Southeast Asia didn't just scar the men who crossed them. They changed how modern warfare understood terrain itself, not as neutral space, but as an active participant. That realization would echo far beyond the jungles. Digite OKOU continue para KEU Giro Ultima part. What the rivers of Southeast Asia ultimately taught US Army snipers was something no battlefield manual had ever fully articulated: terrain is never passive. Declassified operational analyses written after the war reflect a quiet but profound shift in military thinking. Rivers were no longer categorized simply as obstacles or avenues of movement. They were reclassified as dynamic threat zones, environments capable of shaping outcomes independent of enemy action. This was a fundamental change. For snipers, whose survival depended on predicting variables, this lesson cut deep. The rivers had demonstrated that danger didn't always announce itself. It didn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes, it existed as physics, geography, and chance working together in silence. Modern doctrine would later absorb these lessons. Terrain analysis became more granular. Environmental psychology entered training discussions. Survival planning began to account not just for hostile forces, but for hostile environments capable of producing the same effects: isolation, panic, disorientation, and loss. But in Southeast Asia, those realizations were written in real time, with real consequences. Veterans recalled moments when rivers dictated decisions more forcefully than intelligence briefings. When a single crossing could negate days of planning. When the fear of water outweighed the fear of enemy contact. That fear wasn't irrational. It was earned. Because rivers didn't need intent to kill. They only needed gravity. In the jungles, snipers learned to fear what couldn't be suppressed, negotiated with, or outmaneuvered. They learned that mastery of weapons meant nothing if the environment stripped you of balance, breath, and time. Those lessons carried forward. In later conflicts, soldiers trained by veterans of Southeast Asia inherited an unspoken rule: never underestimate the ground beneath you or the water flowing through it. Terrain could isolate units, erase visibility, destroy equipment, and fracture cohesion just as effectively as any ambush. And unlike an enemy force, terrain never withdrew. The rivers also left a moral imprint. They reminded soldiers that war is not solely a contest between opposing wills. It is a collision between human intention and indifferent reality. A sniper could do everything right and still lose, not because of failure, but because the environment refused to cooperate. That truth humbled even the most experienced operators. In reflection, many veterans spoke not with anger, but with respect. Respect for something that had tested them beyond tactics, beyond training, beyond courage. The rivers forced them to confront vulnerability, stripped of heroism, stripped of narrative clarity. Just a human body in moving water, fighting for breath. And that is why the rivers endured in memory. Not as battlefields. Not as landmarks. But as silent adversaries that reshaped how survival itself was understood. Today, those rivers still flow. Calm on the surface. Unchanged to the casual observer. But embedded in their currents is a legacy written by men who crossed them under fire and lived long enough to remember. They learned a final lesson, one that transcended war. Some enemies don't need to chase you. They wait.